Could you explain what to do if someone overstretched the ligaments in their shoulder? Like after you do the shoulder flexion test and the humeral head pops into your thumb when it's in their armpit, what can I do to restore normal flexion, and can I continue to keep that person resilient? Good question. So I want to be clear. When you see something like this, so basically what happens in this case is if you're testing shoulder flexion, you put your thumb in the armpit. Sometimes in some people, you will feel the humerus migrate anteriorly, which obviously is undesirable because we shouldn't have that. What I think is going on is you're having that person fall into internal rotation at the humerus. So if I hit my end range of external rotation that's available, the way I can compensate and go overhead is by driving the elbow slightly out, and that's internal rotation. So if you watch me on the video, as I drive my elbow out, you'll see my hand goes closer to my head. That is internal rotation. Even though it looks like, well, you might think, well, Zach, I'm going out into abduction. Isn't that ER? No, it's not. Because internal rotation is what drives me out into that position. And you can see it if you watch on the video. If I go straight flexion and I don't deviate from that plane, especially based off of the scapulohumeral rhythm article that I'll share with you, straight flexion biases external rotation at the humerus. So then we got to think about, well, what's going on that might be causing this anterior humeral glide? If I fall into ER, what may happen is because of the glides necessary to complete flexion with a little bit of internal rotation, that's going to drive the humerus inferiorly and slightly anteriorly. So you have some degree of it's almost like an anterior subluxation, but I question if that's what's really going on. Stay tuned why I say that. But you'll have a glide that's anterior and inferior at the humerus, and sometimes you can feel that if you put your finger in the person's armpit. So are we dealing with tissue laxity? I am uncertain. What I think it is there's some eccentric orientation of stuff in that area. The reason why I question if it's true laxity is because if we have legitimate tissue laxity, there's not a whole lot that we can do as clinicians to improve the properties of those tissues. One. Two, the other thing to consider is sometimes if you do interventions, you will see that change instantaneously. I've done activities where we've improved shoulder flexion in my supreme clientele, and we recheck and we see if they have that glide, and it's no longer present. So in those few moments of time that I had a person doing an activity, did we really change the laxity of the tissues? I highly doubt it. Not that good by any means. So what's likely going on is you're changing the resting tension of the tissues, and that changes how the person's moving in a favorable way. If someone has legitimate laxity, there's not much we can do about that. That might be a surgical fix. The people who I'm thinking of are people who have recurrent dislocations who cannot get better by conservative measures. This, I don't think necessarily is what's going on in that regard. What we have to do is change the contractile bias of tissues in order to reduce that excessive gliding that we shouldn't see. And the way you do that is by improving your external rotation-based measures. The reason why that glide's happening is because I run out of ER, so I start to IR, and the humerus glides anteriorly to try to make that happen. And we don't want that to happen. So doing things to encourage expansion in the upper back can allow the scapula to continue to upwardly rotate, can restore humeral ER, and allow you to go overhead. Some of my favorite moves would be doing low reaches. I'll link one of my favorite activities to do that in the show notes. Starting with low reaches, working on single arm reaches is also a great way to do that. If I do a single arm reach, that's going to encourage rotation in the thorax, and that can allow for some posterior expansion on one side. So let's say my left shoulder is the one that has that inferior glide. If I want to improve external rotation on that side, I will actually reach with the contralateral arm. What that's going to do is it's going to move the spinous processes away or to the right in that case, which will allow for expansion posteriorly to happen. Once you have those things, then you can work on overhead activities along the same vein to encourage that last bit of upward rotation, making sure the elbow stays locked in. If you do those things, you won't be gliding, most likely, unless you have a tissue issue that needs addressed surgically. So get posterior expansion. If you have that anterior inferior glide, it's likely not a tissue laxity issue. It's likely eccentric orientation of anterior and inferior structures. So get some expansion posteriorly, flip-flop that relationship, and if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question, Anonymous.